Thank you everyone for coming tonight to this town hall. Tonight we're going to be talking about leveling the playing field, something that's really important to a number of nonprofits that all of you are involved in. My name is Dasia Moore. I'm Yale College, Pearson, class of 2018. I'm a YANA board member and former YANA Dwight Hall Fellow. I'm also a reporter at the Boston Globe and co-founder and director of Go South, an organization that places students from well-resourced universities at nonprofits in the South that need human capital to accomplish their dream projects. So this topic is something that's near and dear to my heart, and I'm excited to discuss this tonight with our panelists. So first up, we'll have Georgia Faye Hirsty, who's SOM class of 2022. And she's the co-founder and co-director of Frailty Myths, a nonprofit that is actively reimagining femininity through transformative action-based workshops that provide the hands-on skills for women to fully explore the power and potential of their physicality. Her work also embraces DEI with a focus on developing equitable, high-performing teams and building a more just world. David McCullough III, class of 2017, founded the American Exchange Project in 2019, and it's a first of its kind free cross-cultural exchange program for graduated high school seniors. So AEP has been hailed as a domestic Peace Corps that is effectively bridging the gap and building greater understanding and empathy across class, cultural, racial, and geographic divides throughout the nation. And then finally, we have Susan Scheer, class of 1985. She's the CEO of Institute for Career Development. It's a 100-year-old nonprofit that prepares individuals with disabilities for employment. The unemployment rate for individuals with disabilities was more than double that of people without disabilities before COVID, and they are disproportionately employed in industries that have suffered from the pandemic. So really important and urgent work right now from all of our guests. So the format tonight is just, a little introduction and presentation by each of our panelists. And then we'll have individual Q&As within that. I have some prepared questions, but please, anyone who's attending, drop questions in the chat for specific people. And if we have time towards the end, we can also do a few questions geared at all three panelists. So without further ado, Georgia, if you want to introduce your work, that would be great.
Awesome. Well, thanks so much for having me. I'm really excited to be here and to learn about YANA and to be, increasingly a part of the Yale community. It's been a really exciting, my first year at SOM has been really incredible and inspiring, and I only imagine it will continue to be that. And I'm super excited to tell everyone about Frailty Myths. So I thought I would start with a short video that kind of explains some of our work. I'm having a few internet issues today, so hopefully it works, but I'll go ahead and share my screen and play.
Yeah, and then you go first. That one felt better. Yeah. Patriarchy smash. Remember that we are practicing the world that we're trying to create. And so the moments, it's such an incredible opportunity that so many people don't have very often, to feel conflicted or feel tension in yourself in a moment where you're learning a new skill or trying a new thing. And to really revel in that, we have this space to stop, to talk to each other about the franticness we might be feeling, or the pressure, or the fear of failure, or the fear of messing up. Because in order to build a more just world, we first need to heal from all of the toxic stuff that we have internalized by our surroundings. And so really like lifting up the process that we're not just learning skills to build stuff, but we're also building power within that translates to all different aspects of life.
Can you say to me something like I messed up or anything? Woohoo! And celebrate making mistakes. Yes.
Hell yeah!
But I was able to, with the help of Nadia, teach somebody how to use a song.
Yes!
I was super comfortable with that, and it was just super empowering.
I feel hella empowered by like the spirit, the community, just the fact that we all came together. But what was also kind of new to me was everybody was aware of their space and respect.
Patriarchy smash!
So I hope that the quality was okay. So Frailty Miss is really rooted in kind of understanding that we live in wild and unprecedented times, but that we can still maintain.
Sorry
about that. That we can still maintain hope by practicing. And so we know that both businesses and communities at this point understand the moral imperative and also the competitive advantage of building more diverse and inclusive workplaces, communities, and overall a society that is more just. There was a recent McKinsey report that shows companies, for example, with more gender diverse executive teams were 25% more likely to have above average profitability. But what we know is that changing these deeply ingrained systems of inequity in the workplace culture, but also in ourselves, in the way that we've internalized inequality and different structural forms of oppression is really hard. So Frailty Miss was founded on the idea that in order to build a more just world, we have to create the space for people with the least access to be their full selves and to thrive. And our kind of way of doing that was to pair hands-on skills like woodworking, like climbing, like sailing, with facilitated conversations on oppression and also on empowerment. So we have kind of a two-directional approach. One side is our free community workshops that focus on self-determination and leadership specifically for women's, trans, and gender nonconforming people, prioritizing Black, Brown, and Indigenous folks is one piece. And that gives a chance for folks to really practice being in a new space, thinking about how to heal from internalized forms of oppression. And then the other side, after serving thousands of people, participants kept telling to us that where we needed to be was also in the workplace, so we could work within the workplace so that different firms and governments and institutions could have the space to practice being in the world that we're trying to build. So, and you know, we can see this in the data, despite businesses' best intentions and billions of dollars being spent on diversity trainings, we've seen that the needle around diversity and equity aren't really moving. And so Frailty Miss has really worked to develop one-of-a-kind workshops that use the fundamentals that we've learned from experiential learning, from the concept of practice, to build a curriculum to surface, address, and ultimately change the behaviors and the attitudes that cause harm in the workplace that are related to diversity and inclusion, and to help people on an individual level thrive. And, you know, it's really an amazing thing to watch and to be a part of. So I wanted to just tell a couple stories of each kind of workshop. One is our flagship workshop, and the workshop that is the most popular. We have a 500-person waiting list, is our stool building workshop. So folks apply and they come and they, throughout the course of 5 hours, learn how to build a stool. They learn how to use a number of different power tools. And as different feelings come up, the trained facilitators are then able to step back and work through things that are coming up in real time. And so that really manifests at the end of the workshop after 5 hours, and every participant has built a step stool. They've sawed the pieces, they've screwed it all together, and the whole workshop stops to celebrate the accomplishment of an individual participant. And almost 50% of our participants hesitate in that moment because they don't believe that a thing that they have built with their own hands will actually support them and hold their weight. And so then we're able to pause in that moment and go through the process with them, with all of the participants as a group, as they realize that not only can it hold their weight, but they can actually step onto it in that moment and experience the thing that they built holding that weight. And so we see this kind of beautiful manifestation of empowerment. And then the flip side of that, or the other side of that, is we had an example of one of the diversity workshops we did at a university in Oakland was with a series of carpentry professors, which was interesting, since we use woodworking as a way of accessing some of these structural forms of inequality and behaviors. And in order to stop professors from taking things out of women's hands without asking, we constructed different role plays that were able to really help the professors see when they were manifesting those behaviors, which made them inclined to take something out of someone's hands without asking, and then practice a new way. And it's through that practice that they were able to build the patterns and the behaviors that were better, that were more just, and allowed people to feel more inclusive. And that was the feedback we heard from the students as we continued to follow up with that school. So just a couple other things, and then I'll stop. One of the reasons Frailty Miss formed was recognizing, like I said, that we saw groups and communities with really good intentions not making the change that they wanted to make. And so my experience and the experience of the co-founders comes out of social justice and social justice movements. And I spent a number of years sailing on Greenpeace ships, and my co-founder was working at UCLA getting her PhD. And through those experiences, we kept coming back to this idea that it was really how we create space and how we really attack the behaviors and the attitudes and practice new ones as a way of really seeing these changes. And so from there, we made a curriculum that focused on that focused on facilitated conversations, and now offer tailored diversity, equity, and inclusion workshops to firms, as well as are continuing with our leadership building free community workshops. And at this point, we've served about 2,000 people. Like I said, we have a waiting list of about 500 folks. And we hear from participants all the time how the workshops changed their lives, how now they understand that they can do things that they never thought that they could do before, that they are finding their voice at work. To lift up one particular participant, Shandini, she came to us saying that she didn't feel like she was good enough or smart enough to contribute in her team meetings. And after a series of workshops, where we surfaced those same feelings of not feeling good enough, and then were able to practice new ways, she could then return to work with a newfound confidence and really thrive, and has since been promoted to director, and then subsequently became a Frailty Miss facilitator for our consulting work. And so I'll end with just the 3 ways that I think Frailty Miss is really different in this kind of diversity space, which is that our facilitators have a really unique and diverse experience and expertise. We have activists and social workers and therapists and academics and tradespeople. And the second part that makes us really different is we really focus on changing behaviors through practice and really thinking about the ways that we can get people out of the theoretical, out of the conceptual, out of the judgmental, and just practice the nuance, understanding that it's hard, understanding that we can hold each other accountable in a compassionate way and still make room for change. And then the third piece that really, I think, separates Frailty Miss is that we believe that the people who are most impacted by systems of inequality should be the ones informing and leading the changes in the workplace where so many of us spend our lives. And so our program takes the community workshops and facilitators and leaders from those workshops to not only inform the curriculum of the consulting work, but also those are the people that become the facilitators for that consulting work. And it creates a really beautiful cycle of empowerment, of growth, and and recognizing that it's okay that there aren't clear and linear answers, that through practice we can kind of be better together. And it's been a really beautiful project that has continued to emerge. And as we work with firms and schools, I think one of the most inspiring and profound things for me is to see, particularly in these turbulent times, how much people genuinely want to be better and are genuinely searching for a way to be better. And we feel like we've been able to provide some of that space for people to stretch and grow and step into the best version of themselves. And so, yeah, I think that's pretty much all I have, but thanks so much. And I guess, I don't know if we're doing questions one at a time, but happy to talk more about any of it.
Yes, thank you for sharing so much about your work. Those are wonderful success stories, and I love the symbolism of the stool project. That's great. We do have a few minutes for questions specifically about your work, and then we might circle back to some at the end. But one thing I was curious about is that, on one hand, there's so much in the DEI space, in the space of kind of like women's workplace discrimination and also empowerment. But you found a very unique and fresh kind of way to offer something new in that space. And so I wonder what brought you to that.
Yeah, thanks for the question. And I think, Kenya, I see a similar kind of question. So I think I had a lot of individual experiences, but the thing that really stood out to me and my co-founder, Erin, is that I found myself really wanting to learn how to drive boats and learn how to fix cars and learn how to do these physical things that I didn't need to necessarily define me. I didn't want to become a mechanic, but I kind of felt perpetually shut down and that assumptions were being made about me. And when I was working in the maritime industry, found myself kind of stuck between a rock and a hard place, where I saw that if I pretended that I knew more than I did, or I kind of assumed a certain kind of, if I assimilated into a kind of masculine culture, that I could get access in a way I didn't currently have it. But that also didn't feel good to me. And so the kind of conversations that led to the creation of Frailty Miss was, how do we allow ourselves to stretch and to push and to occupy space that we're told we're not allowed to occupy, without feeling like we have to assimilate into these toxic cultures. And I really, I have to share that even this morning, so my family's visiting, and I have a captain's license. And so I wanted to take them out on the boat. And as I was untying the boat from the trailer, someone, a very well-intended person, I imagine, came running over because he had never seen a woman skipper a boat and was really concerned that I was going to crash. And there are these moments of, I don't doubt that person's intention, but the assumptions of failure, the assumptions of not knowing, really restricted me in my own growth. And so part of the development of Frailty Miss was, how do we create a space where people feel like they can stretch and fail, and that failure doesn't mean lack of access.
Yeah, that's wonderful. I was also wondering, because I heard you bringing up kind of two different concepts throughout your talk, which were, these systemic barriers and systemic discrimination, and then also behaviors. And so I wonder how you and Frailty Miss as an organization think about kind of balancing or walking that line.
Yeah, I think that's one of the places that we really try to explore the nuance of, and really where we come back to philosophically is the place of self-determination And can you all hear me okay? Sorry, I'm getting another. Okay.
Yes.
So is self-determination and the difference between intention and impact. So we really try to work with all of the participants, both the community workshops and the corporate workshops, to say, how do we help individuals feel like their intention is understood, even when their intention is different than their impact. And oftentimes with behaviors that root into systems of oppression, you know, it's like that gentleman this morning. I'm sure the intention was that he was legitimate worried, but it was narratives about women that existed prior to that. And so we really try to get in there and separate that difference and help people understand that sometimes the impact of some of their behaviors and attitudes is really different than their intentions, and is even different than their value system. And that's where it becomes hard. And so if I had to say we had a focal point, it's really allowing the space for people to give a little more patience and a little bit more love to themselves, to say, like, I want to be better, and sometimes I make mistakes. I want to be better, and I am also a product of a racist and sexist environment, and I can work to make and improve that without, you know, that the feedback isn't necessarily an attack on my personhood. And those are the things that we're really trying to practice in a way that I think that conversation is really uncomfortable if it's not held.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much for sharing. Unfortunately, we have to go to the next person, but I did want to take a minute to acknowledge some of the conversation that's happening in the chat, that today is Trans Visibility Day. And so Eli has shared some important stats and information in the chat about the likelihood that trans people are unemployed being much higher than the general population. And so while we're talking about hiring and removing systemic and individual barriers, then that's something that that we should all have in mind. So thank you for sharing that. Okay. We'll also circle back at the end, because I do want to make sure we have time for everyone to talk about what their organizations and what they need from the YANA network, because we're here to connect people, to convene people, and to get people resources as well. But okay, now we'll go to David and the American Exchange Project.
Thank you, Dasia and Georgia. What a wonderful presentation. What an incredible organization as well. Hi, everyone. I'm David McCullough. I'm the executive director and the co-founder of the American Exchange Project. And basically what we're doing is building a national domestic exchange program for high school seniors. So through AEP, seniors all across the United States can study abroad, or as we say, travel abroad in their own country. Our feeling, our deep belief, is that one of the best things this country can do for the preservation of its democracy and the development of its young people is to attach to every high school diploma we give out a ticket to a town that is completely different from the one that kid just grew up in. So kids from the suburbs of Boston ought to go live in small town Oklahoma, and kids from small town Oklahoma ought to go check out San Francisco, and kids from San Francisco ought to go see the Minnesota Lakes regions. And then maybe we'll have a little bit a greater understanding of who we are and where we come from and the circumstances that we all face, and how those circumstances shape our experiences and how those experiences shape our beliefs. I think it's no stretch of anyone's imagination right now to say that our country is very divided, and that the beliefs of different Americans, the political opinions, the socioeconomic realities, and a lot of the social practices of Americans are very, very different from each other. We all went to Yale. I'm sure at some point at Yale, we all walked a few blocks off campus and saw what life was like in New Haven, where the difference between town and gown is pretty stark. Part of what can help create progress for these forms of inequality, these forms of difference, is contact. Folks getting to know each other on a level playing field, folks getting to see, hear stories, meet each other, and hear where they come from. And we think to do that, we ought to start this national domestic exchange program. The idea began 2 years ago. I was fresh out of graduate school, scratching my head about what to do with my life. And so I called up an old Yale professor of mine, Paul Salman, who is the economics correspondent for the PBS NewsHour, and was a guest professor in a program I was a part of at Yale. And we went out to lunch. And we started chatting as as a lot of folks do, having kind of a yuckety yuck about how the country was going to hell in a handbasket and what we ought to do about it. And we landed on the idea that what this country really needed was an organization that could help people become friends with each other. And for whatever reason, I just thought, okay, that's what I want to do with my life. And we set to building it. And we realized pretty soon that it was high school students all over the country, whether you were from Allen, South Dakota, which per capita is the poorest town in America, or Wellesley, Massachusetts, which per capita is one of the wealthiest towns in America, were complaining about the same thing. When we asked kids in Allen, South Dakota, or in Wellesley, Massachusetts, what's your least favorite thing about where you're growing up? By and large, they all said, I feel like I'm growing up in a bubble. Now, the Allen, South Dakota bubble is very different from the bubble at the Slavic Village in Cleveland or in New Hallville or the bubble in Wellesley, Massachusetts. But the phenomenon that kids were feeling was just the same. I'm growing up in a bubble and I can't get out of it, that I've not really been exposed to lifestyles that are very different from the ones I've been growing up around. And that, we thought, is the common solution that we can apply for the problem that can fix all this great problem of division in America. I'll get to this a little later, but one of the interesting things about bringing people together is that, ironically, the people that need to do this sort of work the most are the people who are probably the least sympathetic to the mission. And so with the work that we do, it takes a pretty hefty spoonful of sugar to help the medicine go down. And so we thought free travel might be that spoonful of sugar. If we thought kids were growing up in bubbles, we thought, okay, why not just switch bubbles? Let's just start a national domestic exchange program. That's how we landed on the idea. And so in the fall of 2019, Paul Salman, Bob Glauber, who's a professor at Harvard, and I went to towns that we felt were kind of on the opposite sides of American society. We went to Lake Charles, Louisiana. If you had to pick a heart of the Tea Party, it's Lake Charles. It's a working class oil city down in the boot heel of the bayous of Louisiana. We went to Kilgore and Longview, Texas, up in the tall pine country of East Texas. And then we went to Cotulla, Texas, down in the oil country, a small town in South Texas. And then after that, we went to Wellesley, Concord, and Sudbury, Massachusetts, affluent, by and large, liberal towns here in the suburbs of Boston. And we shopped the idea around and everyone loved it. And then we enrolled about 12 kids to go on an exchange and to first meet each other on Zoom in the fall of 2019. So we intended to get these kids together for about 5 sessions on Zoom, and those sessions quickly turned into over 200. An enrollment of 12 climbed to above 75 over the course of the year without marketing. And this was a nonprofit that had 1 employee, yours truly. That was around this time last year. And as the pandemic set in, we realized that the one thing we'd been designed to do was the one thing we couldn't do: travel. We had basically opened up a bar during Prohibition. We were stuck. And the Great Adventurers program had me sitting here in the attic of the home I grew up in, running virtual calls, which is not exactly what you'd imagine when you wanted to start a traveling program. So throughout the summer, we pivoted, we scratched our heads, we wondered what to do. We raised enough money for an operational budget. And we continued to run this open Zoom program with kids from all over the country. We kind of made Zoom the cafeteria table at which any kid in America could sit at any given time and have a conversation with each other. And we noticed that that open format created some very interesting realities in our program. We began with a very balanced and diverse population of students, diverse in terms of socioeconomics, diverse in terms of political beliefs, diverse in terms of gender, background. We had folks that kind of represented the United States from the 7 towns that we worked in. As we scaled, though, we noticed that kids who were liberal, who were from affluent towns, and who were on their way to college kind of took over the calls. And just like happens in any sort of cafeteria room anywhere, a clique was formed at this cafeteria table. And the clique abided by the characteristics that I just mentioned. And what we found was that conservative kids felt immoral when placed next to liberal kids and didn't want to show up, and that there was this kind of holier than thou-ness that a lot of the liberal kids in the programs had over a lot of the conservative kids. And that for the kids from affluent communities made kids who were middle class in this country feel poor. And then the biggest one was that kids who had been afforded great educations and were on their way to college made kids who were not afforded those same opportunities and were not on their way to college feel really, really left out and left behind in the race. And that theme of feeling left out is all over the United States right now. And it's a big, big piece of what we're trying to fix at AEP. And so we thought, all right, this program wasn't necessarily what we were designing to do. So we went back to the drawing board and we've redesigned AEP. And here's what we're going to launch on September 1st. The way AEP works is it's going to be a national domestic exchange program for free for high school seniors. We'll partner with communities all over the United States, and we go to those communities and we work with local leaders and say, okay, what's great about your town? And if we were to hand you 20 kids in the summer, what should they do? And in Cotulla, Texas, they said, okay, well, they should come and staff the Wild Hog Cook-Off. And in Cody, Wyoming, they said, okay, we have the Cody Stampede every Friday. They should come help set up the Cody Stampede, or maybe the Buffalo Bill historical exhibit at the museum. In San Diego, they said, oh, they should go volunteer and work at the border. In Boston, they said they need to go to a Red Sox game and maybe do work at the harbor or whatever big event Boston is having that summer. Martha's Vineyard wants kids to work at the agricultural fair. Kenai, Alaska wants kids to help with the dip net salmon fishing contest and then go do work in the indigenous villages surrounding Kenai, Alaska. Imagine what it would do for our country if every single summer, kids from all over the United States were heading to Kenai, Alaska to volunteer in the dip net fishing contest. Or kids from small town Texas were off tasting the blueberry pie at the agricultural fair at Martha's Vineyard. Or if kids from Martha's Vineyard were off staffing the rodeo in Cody, Wyoming. What would they learn about the politics of our country, the economics of our country? What would they learn about the country that they're growing up in? That's what AEP is creating. So the way it works is that kids between seniors in high school between September 1st and January 1st register with AEP and put down a list of preferences of where they'd like to go based on the communities we've partnered with on their website. On our website. From between January 1st and March 1st, AEP puts on the sorting hat and sends kids all over the United States. We take in their preferences and the demographics about where they're from. They don't get to choose where they go, but we do take their preferences in account. This kind of accounts for some of those soft spots that I mentioned earlier. Then after that, kids enter a virtual program. They're part of two groups. Group one is with all the kids that they're traveling with to the town that they're going to. So let's say Ken and I are off to to Muskogee, Oklahoma. We would be in an online group with all the kids going to Muskogee and all the kids from Muskogee hosting. And then we'd be in a group with all the kids from New Haven who are hosting and all the kids coming to New Haven that summer. We interact, we hang out, we do all the sorts of activities we do on our online program right now. Some of those activities are, let's debate whether or not a hot dog is a sandwich. Let's talk about abortion rights. Let's take something off of our desk and tell a story about why that particular item means a lot to us, or tell me your life story in 6 words. What these online sessions do is they get the kids to get to know each other. They prime them for the culture shock that they're about to experience traveling across the United States. And it allows us all sorts of interesting opportunities to involve other organizations, prominent adults, and frankly, get the parents to meet each other. And then in the summer, off they go. Right now, AEP has brought on a staff of 6. Thank God, I'm not the only employee anymore. We have a volunteer staff of 20. We have about 50 plus advisors, and we are currently partnering with communities all across the country before we launch this National Domestic Exchange Program on September 1st. We are bound to, or at least I am binding the organization to 2 lofty promises. The first is that every exchange has to be free. The second is that we can never hand out a rejection letter. If we create a barrier to entry, either financial or imposed by some sort of application process, we'll actually be exacerbating the problem that we're trying to fix. AEP really is trying to level the playing field. There are a lot of kids in this country who feel left out, who feel left behind, and they're not wrong necessarily. A big piece of what AEP is trying to do is to remind every American that we all have something to learn and that we all have something to teach. And so really what we need to do to be engaged citizens is understand each other, learn more about each other, and share what we have to teach, and frankly, learn what we have to learn. I'll leave it there.
Great, thank you, David. It was wonderful to hear about the work that you've been doing, and also how you've adapted during the pandemic, which, like you said, is so central to your mission and function, the travel piece. One thing I was interested in, because it was so great that you kind of brought up the challenges of engaging people who might not actually be interested in or interested in breaking down the very barrier that you're trying to address.
Yeah.
So I just wonder, like how much of that was a part of your thinking from the beginning?
The big part of the thinking, I think, that was what made me realize there's a growing movement of democracy building nonprofits. We've all witnessed the election of the last year. We've seen the country split apart. We all certainly saw what happened on January 6th. And one problem in the democracy building field is that most organizations are really, really good at preaching to those folks who are looking for a religious experience. which is arguably not the folks who need to be brought into the bridge building field or the democracy building field the most. So I was always after, what would engage the kids who might not be interested in this? And if you go to most high school kids and you say, hey, do you want to develop empathy for someone who disagrees with you politically? They'll probably nod to be dutiful because they're worry they might get graded on that. But then if you say to a kid, hey, do you want to go to Boston for free? Or would you like to go work on a ranch in South Texas? That's when you get the, oh, cool, okay. And we were after that kind of, oh, cool. And free travel, we found, galvanizes the widest population, or motivates, or inspires the widest population of high school kids, because it's really them who need to be reminded of and shown what it means to be a citizen in democracy, and really the problems going on in our nation right now. I think a lot of kids are numb to it, and a lot of kids can't see what they don't see, and so they're really not aware and they're not exposed, and that's problematic.
Yeah, there's a question from Mark, which I think maybe gets at a bigger idea. So Mark was asking, have any LGBTQ kids traveled from Massachusetts, for example, to Oklahoma or Texas, for example? And I think, for me, that gets at a larger question too, about so much of what you're talking about is political difference. But of course, we've seen, especially in the past year, that many of those differences also involve real differences in safety and inclusion and quality of life. So I wonder how you're kind of thinking through those things and ensuring a safe exchange for everyone.
Well, the first thing we do is, we vet every home that we stay in. And one thing, our little insight that allows AEP to be possible is that, having traveled the country, to almost every corner of it, to every socioeconomic place, where the vast majority of Americans are really, really good people who care about the right things, who work hard, and who are open-armed and welcome the stranger. I think there are a lot of problems in this country. I think there are a lot of problems that need fixing in this country. I also think that there are a lot of misinterpretations of what's out there when you go out and see the United States. We have actually, Mark, yet to run a trip. So we haven't had kids travel yet, but we will this summer, and we will have LGBTQ plus kids traveling to the South this summer. I don't foresee problems because those kids have met and hung out in an online platform already, and they're already really good friends. We vet every home that kids stay in. We prime the exchange with an online program. Almost every single kid, we surveyed our students last year, 97 or 93% of the kids in the program said that they made a close friend through the online portion of the program. 100% of the kids in the program said that they recommended every kid in America join AEP. And so we've seen that if kids can get along with each other before they go on the trip, then they'll have an ally, they'll have a friend. And that matters a ton, especially when that friend is extended to the family that they're staying in. AEP began when I took a road trip on a Yale fellowship the summer of junior year. And I'm David McCullough III of Phillips Academy and Yale University. I'm sort of soft and white, and I was going on a research project to look into poverty and education, and I was going to small town South Texas, the Pine Ridge Indian Reservation in South Dakota, and then some of the more blighted neighborhoods of Cleveland. I was the only white kid in all three of those communities in the vast majority of rooms and places that I was in. I thought for sure I'd have doors slammed in my face. I thought for sure I'd have inflammatory words said to me. I thought for sure I would not be welcome where I went. That wasn't the case anywhere, and I talked to over 300 people on that trip. That insight of the fact that most Americans are really good people is what we feel that most people are going to realize. And it's what our students have realized. And we've had almost 200 take part in the online program now, as they get out there and learn more about their country. By and large, all of our kids say, holy cow, there's much more that unites us and divides us. And I wish every American knew that right now.
Yeah, thank you for addressing that. Okay, I want to make sure that we have time to get Susan and then circle back at the end. But thank you so much, David. Yeah, Susan, if you could talk to us about your work at the Institute for Career Development, that would be great.
Great, thank you. Both of the speakers who are before me have filled me with awe at the great work that you're doing, and given me a lot to think about in terms of the connections and the themes that are coming up for me. So I'm going to do mine, I'm going to approach mine a little bit differently. When I was in contact with Rachel and with Ken before coming here tonight, they shared with me that to the best of their knowledge, they don't believe that anybody with a disability or disability issues have ever been in front of a YANA event. And I think that speaks volumes, and that's really not surprising to me, unfortunately, at all, and really where I'm gonna be a little bit more folksy and personal and less of a presentation than what our other folks have done. So I wanted to start with just talking a little bit about me and my journey and how that relates to the absence of disability as an issue. So I am myself a person with a disability. I have spina bifida, which is a congenital defect, and I used crutches for 25 years, and about 11 years ago I had spinal surgery that went awry, and I now use a wheelchair. I went through the general ed system from K to 12. I grew up in a pretty blue collar area on Long Island, and this was before there were any laws requiring schools to admit students with disabilities. And my mother, who was my first teacher as an advocate, was able to get them to agree to let me go to the local public school if she promised to never be more than 10 minutes away, so that if anything came up at all, no one in the school was committed to supporting me whatsoever, and she was obliged to do so. She went on every field trip with me for 12 or 13 years. She really put her life on hold to make that possible for me. When I got to my senior year of high school, I was told that I was not college material, even though I was the valedictorian of my class. And eventually I was advised to go to community college. Unfortunately, a family friend who had just come into our lives and was sort of my fairy godmother, who was a little bit more worldly than my own mom, paid for a college counselor for me, something that nobody in my neighborhood ever did, especially 30 years ago. And that person opened my eyes to other opportunities, and I wound up going to Yale. But my experience was very typical of the tyranny of low expectations for people with disabilities. And I wish that I could tell you that 30 years later, the situation is substantially different, and it certainly has improved, but not nearly as much as you would hope after 30 years. So Ken asked me to tell you a little bit about what my experiences were like at Yale, and they were really formative for me in the path that my life took and becoming an advocate and becoming an activist. If you think back on your experience at Yale, you probably did not see very many people with disabilities, with visible disabilities. Those of you who have graduated more recently, it was probably a little bit different, but Yale was built a long time ago. The buildings are very inaccessible. The campus is huge. It's cold. There's a lot of snow. Had I known I was going to be on crutches when I accepted admission, I would never have gone. So thank goodness I didn't know. I lived in Welch on Old Campus my freshman year. They insisted that I live on the 3rd floor, and I went up and down on crutches and with a long leg brace and a short leg brace many times a day. I learned to be very careful about planning ahead so that I could minimize the amount of up and down. I struggled with all sorts of things, like how to do my laundry because it was in the basement. And as you know, although people are, very kind at Yale, they're also very busy and very competitive and very worried about their grades. And so even though I had lovely roommates, some of whom are still my best friends in the world, they did not want to help me with my laundry as opposed to studying or going out to a bar. And when it came time for us to move off old campus and go in, I was in what was then Calhoun and is now called Hopper College, and women were not allowed to live on the first floor of the dorms then, because New Haven was not the safest of places in the mid 80s. And my roommates literally had to go to the dean of the college and attest to them that they understood that living with me was a hazard and unsafe. Can you imagine, you know, asking somebody who's going to be a rising sophomore to do that? And I, you know, was forever grateful to them for taking a chance on doing that. Experiences like that really stayed with me. But I was very involved with Dwight Hall, and I went to try to find other students with disabilities who might want to work with me to address these kinds of concerns. And while there were a few people in undergrad who had disabilities, and we all kind of knew who each other was, none of them wanted to be in a room together, because there is nothing that was less appealing to them than walking into a room with somebody on crutches and somebody else who was had a leg amputation, because everybody was going to stare. And we all had gotten where we were by passing, by, even if we had a visible disability, by really ignoring it. That was the basis of everybody's identity. So they just did not want to meet. So I eventually found some folks in the graduate school and in the law school, and we together formed the first student organization for Yale students with disabilities. And our maiden voyage was to put up, you know, the wheelchair access sign. We made red circles around it with a slash through it that meant no, and we papered all around the campus to show all of the inaccessibility. And it actually got picked up in the New York Times, because of course everybody at Yale was a stringer for the New York Times. So that was a very heady experience about how you could really start to influence people's thinking about this. So I think people are surprised when I talk about this, about, you know, how I was so isolated in my identity. I never had a friend with a disability until I got to Yale, and that was there I had very few. But disability is so common. It is the essence of the human experience. It interacts with race, with nationality, with ethnicity, gender, sexual orientation, class, religion, age, you name it. There are more than 1 billion people around the world have a disability. That's 1 in 7 of us. And according to the CDC, 1 in 4 Americans has a disability. 30% of American families have a family member with a disability. So we all either have a disability, are going to acquire a disability, have someone in our family who has a disability, or have a friend who has a disability. And it's, as I said, the one diversity group that anybody can join at any time, and many of us will at some point in our lives. And as the last year has shown us, that number is growing. Not only do we have an aging population here in the United States and in many parts of the world, but unfortunately, COVID, as we've all read, is producing lasting disability impacts, both physical and certainly mental health issues that are going to be long lasting. So I have spent the last 30 years working in city government and in nonprofits in leadership positions. And in that time, I have always been the only person with a visible disability in my job, and the only woman with a visible disability. I did not have peers, and I haven't had mentors at all. I mean, that's such an amazing thing to say to a group of Yaleys, right? That there is no one. There is no one for me to have helped me find my path, and that has really has really weighed on me as I've gone through my career. Because when you look around, 70% of people with disabilities are not in the workforce, 70%. If you picked up the Times tomorrow, the New York Times, and the headline said 70% of women, 70% of African Americans, you know, fill in the blank, were not in the workforce, it would be a national scandal. There would be congressional hearings and reports issued. But this is the only group that it seems to be okay for this to be out of work and live in abject poverty. I run a nonprofit. I don't make that much money. I am literally in the top 0.5% of earners for people with disabilities. I get a special census form sent to me because of that. So it gives you an idea of what we're talking about. And worse than that, those numbers, they haven't moved in 30 years, despite the Americans with Disabilities Act, despite just coming off of the longest economic expansion in the country's history. And of course, as Dasia said in the introduction, COVID has just made this worse. People with disabilities were the last one in, they were the first one fired, and they will be the last ones to return to the workforce. So my organization, the Institute for Career Development, which has changed its name because in its first iteration, it was the ICD, was the Institute for Crippled and Disabled Men, was started 100 years ago to help wounded returning World War I veterans. They invented the field of rehabilitation, and even more novel, it was in the service of getting people back to work, which was really a radical idea at the time. We are cross-disability, which is very unusual, right? Most disability organizations, they work with people with mental health issues, or they work with people who are blind. But in our thinking, the issues that people with disabilities have are more in common than not, and that there is real value in having a shared community. We work with youth and we work with adults. Our offices are in Lower Manhattan, and it's that journey that I just described to you that really has led me to this current role. After the 30 years that I spent, I really was struck by that unicorn status. And I wanted to give other people with disabilities the same opportunities for economic mobility, for independence, and for dignity through employment that I have been so fortunate to have. So how do we do that at ICD? We do very extensive career assessments for people with disabilities that are focused on identifying people's strengths and abilities and interests. That doesn't sound very, very significant, except that when you realize that it's literally in the name, disabled, right? All of the focus for people with disabilities is on what they can't do. Could you imagine if every day you got up and your entire identity was shaped around what you couldn't do? We do vocational training. We started the first fully accessible Cisco networking academy. We teach soft skills. We do disability pride and disability history, which it may be something that people don't even realize exists. And we do job placement. We work with about 1,400 people a year. We put about 250 people through our training classes, and we place about 300 people in jobs. And who are our students? Our students are the people that the New York City public school system has completely failed. They are almost all people of color. Many of them did not graduate from high school. Their disabilities weren't properly addressed. They acted out in schools. Some of them wound up suspended, in jail, homeless, substance abuse issues, sometimes all of those. And in their mid-20s, they kind of wake up and they want to go to work. And they are incredibly motivated. But they face a lot of challenges because they don't have a high school diploma, or even when they do, or even when they have some college, they don't necessarily have a work history. And of course, they are facing incredible amounts of bias and misconceptions. And, you know, I talked a few minutes ago about it not able. There's so many misperceptions and misinformation about people with disabilities. It's like something, you know, biblical or mythical, that they're objects of pity. There's something to be feared. You know, think about all the literature and the movies that we've all watched, that people with disabilities are either really angry or they're inspirational and better than everyone else. So we do a lot of work with employers on disability etiquette and awareness and how to include people with disabilities. And we create a safe space for employers to share those fears and to say, you know, whatever you're thinking, other people are thinking it, let's talk about it. Let's get some real facts on the ground. Let's make you feel comfortable so that you really do want to become a champion and to welcome people with disabilities to your organization, and to give people who deserve a chance, an opportunity to be lifted out of poverty and to not be defined every minute of the day by what they can't do or what society says they can't do. So right now we're really focused on post-COVID. We know that we're going to be rebuilding the economy. This is the moment that I've been waiting for 30 years to make sure that people with disabilities are at the table to create a truly inclusionary, equitable economy. So everybody's, the previous speakers talked a little bit about diversity, and my joke is always that disability is the last D in diversity, equity, and inclusion. But I'm really optimistic that the time has arrived and that disability is going to be celebrated as a form of diversity that adds value to an organization, and that we as a community should be seen as adding something, not lacking something. So I'm going to stop there. And
yeah, thank you so much, Susan. And I so regret that we don't have time for more in-depth questions. But yeah, I really appreciate everything that you shared here, and that everyone shared. And I think that one thing I'm taking away from this is that, you know, nonprofits address systemic barriers in so many different ways, but they, you know, because these things are so big, and something that we always have to hold in mind is, you know, who has the power in the situation, who has the power to change it, and how do we address those systems as well as help people who are living on the other end of those systemic exclusions and discrimination. Thank you all so much. I really appreciate it. And yes, everyone, please connect and continue communicating through YANA so we can all continue learning about your work. I hope everyone has a wonderful Wednesday evening.